Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
שיכור מנוש.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Pichuczka niewiózł.
Dave Feldman is a senior software engineer, lipid and cholesterol investigator, and self-experimenter. He's done a ton of tests on himself over the past 4 years that are making huge waves in the nutrition world. He's helping the world rethink cholesterol and go away from the standard lipid hypothesis to the energy model of how our lipid system works. He's got a great Facebook group with an active audience of lean mass hyper-responders. He also travels around the country speaking at conferences. This is a must listen if you have high LDL cholesterol on a high-fat diet or still think that cholesterol is bad. You should also go back and listen to the Ivor Cummins episode in season 1, which gives more of a foundation of knowledge and a bunch of other great info on the topic. We jump straight in and get technical in the beginning, but stick around. We backtrack and give a lot more context and explain things more clearly. You want to keep going even if we get into the weeds because we come out again and go over a lot of useful information and ideas. This might be the last time you hear from me before the Food Lies Indiegogo campaign ends. This is the last chance to pre-order the film and support us. The crowdfunding ends Monday, April 1st at midnight. We have a ways to go, but if we get support in these last few days, I think we'll hit our goal. We're still looking for private investors who want to get equity in the film by contributing $15,000 or more. Please reach out or pass this along if this is a possibility. Thanks so much. I'm really in love with this community. You've all been so supportive, and it looks like we're going to be able to make a super high quality film to get this information out to the world without any outside interests or producers stepping in and influencing the message. Click through the link in the show notes or from foodlies.org. That's foodlies.org. Now let's hear from the great Dave Feldman. Awesome. Dave Feldman, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Brian. How are you?
I'm good. I guess I always kind of give some context of how this all came to be, but we met in San Diego right after you did Dr. Peter Attia's podcast, and you did your whole 3-hour cholesterol talk with him.
3.5 hour.
Oh, was it? Yeah. And Ivor Cummins, I was talking to Ivor, and you just came in, the other cholesterol guy.
That's right.
Yeah.
You're the other engineer.
Exactly. And I'm a mechanical engineer myself, so I have to bring that up as well. I love this engineering approach to things, and I'm sure we'll get into all this kind of stuff, and you can talk about your background and just how you look at things from that engineering angle, which I think helps a lot, right? So yeah, you've had a crazy day. What's been going on?
Well, I just completed, the best way I could put it is I just had a marathon of experiments. Mm-hmm. And certainly I've had times before where an experiment started out as one thing and it turned out there'd be some data or something, some new information that might come out of the experiment that wasn't expected. This one was a bit different. This one, there ended up being some experiments within the experiment. So I started out wanting to do a 30-day carnivore diet experiment. Mm. And I told everyone in advance, unlike most of my experiments where the parameters are very tight, this one I am committing for it to be all animal-sourced products, but I'm not committing to what was going to be the initial setup, which was that I was going to see if I could go 30 days on just beef alone. Mm-hmm. And let me be more specific, bovine-sourced food. So, for example, I might have beef liver, I might have, ribeye steak, I might have different cuts of meat, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But as I was getting into it, 10 days in, I did my first home lipid test, and I was dumbfounded to find that my triglycerides were extraordinarily high. Mm. And this was actually kind of exciting for me because we've had at the site, cholesterolcode.com, we have people occasionally coming and they're going, I don't understand. I'm on a very low carb diet or even, zero carb. And I've seen my triglycerides jump up like crazy. Mm-hmm. And for your listeners who might not know, triglycerides are literally the fat-based energy. And if you get in a blood test, it's the fat that's found in the blood per given measurement. So milligrams per deciliter is common for US, of course. And if that's really high, like in this case, it was, I want to say 220, that's usually associated with disease. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, the benefit is, of course, I have done 110 of these tests now. So I'm already well aware that it's very volatile.
Variable, yeah, based on so many things, what you ate, fasting.
Yep. And that's part of why this was exciting, was I didn't immediately jump to the conclusion that I had some kind of disease or there was some problem. I jumped to the conclusion that, hey, I may have actually turned the right tumblers to see the effect that we've seen reported to us, but that I've never seen before. Because anytime I've done waking up triglycerides on that cardio check before this point, it's always been low triglycerides.
Mm-hmm.
So awesome. Now we have something new to work with. And naturally, because I had only been eating beef up to that point, I jumped to, hey, this could be related to either the composition of what I was eating or the low glycemic level, which is to say the low level of insulin that I could expect to have for this being nearly zero carb, right? Mm-hmm. And as of this moment in time, I think that that's actually what it is that I brought my fasting insulin down so low that there's a lower, I guess you could say, uptake and turnaround, sort of a staging and pacing of triglycerides going into not just the non-adipose tissues that are using it, the fat cells, but also into the fat cells themselves, the adipose tissue. That's my working theory right now. And part of what substantiated that is, even though I was running on very low basal insulin, at 12 hours of fasting, my triglycerides would then be low. So I might wake up with higher triglycerides after, let's say, 6 hours of sleep, something like that, which might have been 8 hours since I last ate because it was over the holidays. Well, okay, that might be why it could be elevated on top of it being low glycemic index. But once I hit 12 hours, then it all falls to under 100. And this is a very big deal because while we've been giving advice to people, qualifying that it's non-medical, et cetera, that we would prefer that they follow the original guidelines that were set in being fasted for at least 12 hours, I always thought that there was a little more leverage, a little more, I guess you could say, grace period if you say only fasted 10 hours. Mm-hmm. I now feel very differently because of this experiment, because you can actually see just how all over the place it is right up until I hit close to about 12 hours.
I got a blood cholesterol test and they didn't even tell me to fast. Really,
right.
Really
That's
weird.
The new guidelines. Yes. Huh. And I'm very vocal about this. I'm very much in disagreement about this because especially if you are on a low carb diet and you're having a fatty meal within even just a few hours of when you're taking your blood draw, you've literally installed triglycerides into your bloodstream carried on board chylomicrons. So you're asking for a very confounded lipid profile at a minimum. And I don't even know about the other metabolic markers because I haven't done a lot of non-fasted tests, but I suspect they're going to be offset as well. So I definitely am much more a fan of fasting, and definitely now more than ever fasting at least 12 hours, water only fasting, no coffee or anything else, so that you can get clean numbers.
Yeah, well, there's so much to it. I think we jumped in too quickly. So we need some more context of who you are, what you do, and just cholesterol in general. What do people need to know if they're new to all this? Some people don't listen from the beginnings of the podcast, of my series, and some people just randomly come to this and don't know much about nutrition even. So,
oh, for sure.
Let's start at the top and then work our way back.
No worries. Let's go back in time to just a little over 3 years ago. I was a software engineer. I was actually programming a video game at the time and having a blast. And I was about 7 months into my ketogenic diet when, I get this really, really scary cholesterol report. I see that my cholesterol had jumped up substantially, both my total and my LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, and I flipped out. So I start learning everything that I can about cholesterol and how this system moves around cholesterol inside your body. And I found more and more that it actually resembles a software network, one that I work on all the time. And I was really wondering if I was just projecting, my own bias onto that. But I now stand by that to this day. I believe that indeed it has many different things in common with a distributed object network. Which is, well, for example, probably the most prominent example is if you were to right now Google a lipoprotein, what you'd see is something that kind of looks like a basketball. It kind of has bumps on the outside, but it also has these kind of snaky, bigger bumps that are sitting on top of it. Those are called apolipoproteins, or sometimes just APOs. Those are a lot like headers on packets. They actually tell where that thing is supposed to go.
Like an email
Those-
header?
Yeah, like an email header. It's let me give you an example. A APO called APO-C2 that sits on top of one of these basically says, "Hey, I've got energy inside, and I'm good to take it out." And there's receptors that endothelial cells will have that can bind to that, and in binding to it, some chemical reactions, some lipases, and so forth involved, where basically it starts to break apart the fat-based cargo inside, and it then comes into the cell. Now, as it releases these fatty acids, it slowly, like a balloon, it starts to deflate and get smaller and smaller, and because it's losing that cargo. And after it's lost enough of that cargo, its ApoC2 gets exchanged. It actually gets taken off of it, such as by HDL particles, for example. And now that's no longer a label that can be bound to by other cells because, hey, you don't have the energy anymore. And now you only have one APO left, and that APO is ApoB. And that thing I just described before that had the ApoC2, that was a VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. Those are always bloated, full of triglycerides. Now it's an LDL, which you hear about all the time, low density lipoprotein, but you usually hear about its cholesterol cargo, low LDL cholesterol. So in that respect, yeah, as I was learning about this, I was like, wow, this really is a very sophisticated system that actually seems to be very well regulated. If that's true, why would my cholesterol have climbed so much if I believe that this is such a well-regulated network? And that's what started me on my journey. I then started doing biohacking right out of the gate, and found that actually the less fat I ate, while still remaining on a ketogenic ratio, the higher my cholesterol would go. And conversely, the more fat I ate, the lower it would go. Its baseline would still be relatively high because I was powered by fat, and I was learning about that at the time. But I could, if I wanted to, drop it in I want to say about 9 months after this all began. I did my first public presentation of this data by wrapping it into an experiment where I, in the middle of the experiment and over the course of the conference that I was presenting at, I was just chowing down on fatty foods left and right. And as I did that, I presented in my presentation, I said, I bet my reputation, everything about me, that tomorrow when I get my blood drawn for a second time, it'll be far lower than when I got it drawn 2 days before this presentation. And I was right. It dropped 73 milligrams per deciliter. My LDL-P dropped by over 1,000 points, 1,000 millimoles.
We should put that in perspective. So for one, the mainstream doctors and medical community don't think it can vary that much between the few days. And two, you're going opposite of what they're saying. Basically, you're eating more fat and your LDL is getting lower.
That's right. If there's any single thing somebody should take from my research right now, I mean, even if you're not a fan of low carb, it's that lipids are very dynamic in almost certainly any healthy metabolism. So if you don't already have existing metabolic derangements that are giving a different reason why your lipids may be at the levels that they're at, you probably can manipulate your lipids right now. You can probably move them up and down like I am, particularly in a short span of time. But more and more, my research started leading me to, okay, so then why is it that you end up with these different set points, these kind of preference points, and how much is this related to the energy metabolism you're fueled by? And the answer is quite a lot. So if I were to go low fat, high carb vegan tomorrow, I'm quite confident I could get my LDL below 100. I could get it maybe even below 70 milligrams per deciliter, which to a cardiologist would just be amazing. It'd be super ideal.
Yeah.
But what I think it is really all that's happening is I'm being powered less by fat. And now I'm being powered more by carbohydrates. And so long as I don't do it in excess so that it starts making triglycerides out of those carbs, then I may be okay. I mean, the nutrition side is something I'll let other people debate with. But the main thing is, am I being powered by carbs or am I being powered by fat? And much of my research is, hey, if you're being powered by fat, particularly if you're healthy, lean, and or athletic, any of those together, along with being very low carb, there's a pretty decent chance you'll have higher levels of cholesterol, because cholesterol ride shares, as I was talking about earlier, ride shares with those fatty acids in the VLDLs that eventually become LDLs.
Yeah, so it's not a bad thing. Basically, this is your hypothesis, and we can't say this is medical advice or, all that disclaimer. But it seems that if you're fat adapted, like so many people are that are probably listening, that you're running on fat for fuel. So you have more of these running around in your system.
Yeah, I try to be a good scientist and say, which is a completely valid statement, I don't know what I don't know. I can't say for certain that the lipid hypothesis is false. Could very well be true.
Well, first, people don't even know probably what the lipid hypothesis is and compared to what your hypothesis is.
Yeah, fair enough. Look, the lipid hypothesis, you could look it up on Wikipedia right now. It'll say effectively that the amount of cholesterol, or it may have been updated to say the amount of LDL particles in the bloodstream will be what drives atherosclerosis, or at least it'll be one way in which atherosclerosis is. Yes, correct. Thanks. And I know I've been in technical mode probably all day, so thanks for jumping.
Yeah. Just someone reached out to me, and it was a friend was like, "Wait, I don't even understand half the words you guys are using." So.
Yes, absolutely fair. So let's back it up a step. The idea is this. The idea is that the more saturated fat you have, this is going back to the Ansel Keys. We're talking like 6-7 decades ago, something like that. The more of this cholesterol that is in your bloodstream, the more it is clogging up the pipes. That's the common refrain that's talked of all the time. Mm-hmm. Now, as they learn more and more that actually the cholesterol's on board these boats, these LDL particles. Oh, well, then maybe it's like, and you'll hear this analogy a lot, it's like BB guns. It's firing into your arterial wall. And the more BBs that are being fired, the more risk. Mm-hmm. And to be fair, this hypothesis came up when there was a very loose association, not a strong one, but a loose one, between having higher levels of cholesterol. Back then, they didn't even have the distinction of LDL, higher levels of cholesterol and higher rates of heart disease. Now, as they've gotten more sophisticated, they've not only narrowed it down to LDL cholesterol, but they've since moved to LDL particle count. And there's a lot more emphasis on that. But
as the quote bad one, you're saying that
as the bad one,
quote,
right?
Yes.
And they now will say, let's look at just LDL, or for that matter, let's look at non-HDL, HDL being the so-called good cholesterol, or more specifically that it's on board the HDL particles, cholesterol found on board HDL particles. Side note, the cholesterol that's found in each of these particles is the same cholesterol. Mm-hmm. There's no like specialized cholesterol. It's really the same one. So anyway, atherosclerosis is that buildup of the plaque in the arterial wall. You've seen pictures of it. I've seen pictures of it. You see this artery and you see this weird bump. And in the bump, there's this plaque that's in the endothelial layer. And you see it narrowing or you see it bursting, right, to create a blood clot, things along those lines. So this was a particular interest to me because what I wanted to do was find where, very early on, I wanted to find, where the bullseye study is that just like makes it abundantly clear that this hypothesis is now proven true, that the lipid hypothesis that, more LDL means more heart disease is fact, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to say that I found anything that proved it flatly false. What I will say is that we do have a way to cause atherosclerosis in a very reliable fashion, and that is to damage or cause dysfunction in those very cells that line the arterial wall, known as endothelial cells. So that where I told you the plaque is, that's the scene of the crime. If you go into an animal right now, and they do this every day in labs, and you go into its carotid artery and you denude it, which is to say you use this balloon catheter and you beat it up a little bit. You're expanding and contracting it several times. You can induce atherosclerosis in that carotid artery of that rodent, right? That's a direct, like you induced atherosclerosis that would not have otherwise shown up there.
Yeah.
So we do know that damage will accomplish this. It will achieve the goal, if that's our goal, to create atherosclerosis. I have not yet seen any study that controlled for damage in the endothelial layer or dysfunction in the endothelial layer that induced atherosclerosis with LDL particle count or concentration. And that became super relevant to me in my research, because the more I was learning about this from the metabolic side, the more I started to wonder, hey, wait a sec, is there two parts to this story? Is the first part of this story one about energy delivery, which explains why many of us on a keto diet would see our LDL high? And is the second part of this story one about a response that the LDL particles are supposed to be used for? And that's actually the most exciting thing. The most exciting thing is, I think, that LDL particles, really the particles as they start out as VLDLs, they have two shifts. The first shift is to deliver energy. The second shift is actually like a patrol. So the first shift takes only like about an hour. It takes about an hour to drop off all of the triglycerides when you're bloated with them as a VLDL. Then they clock out and become an LDL, and they hang out for 2 to 4 days, right? And for 2 to 4 days, it turns out they have all of these functions we never hear about. They have, for example, immune response. They can bind to pathogens. They provide alpha tocopherol to reactive oxygen species to turn them into non-reactive products. And the one thing that I find especially important is you find if endothelial cells get damaged, they will send out cytokines, and past a certain threshold to the liver will upregulate LDL particles directly, suggesting, because you also see this with the endothelial cells that are damaged, that they're responding to an inflammatory event. So it could be a reparative event.
And then you had a patrol car analogy, or I don't know if it's yours or other people's. Keep trying to make it simpler after you give us a technical version.
Yeah, the patrol car, like I like to joke, you want to have a lot of patrol cars going around your neighborhood with cops in them that look bored. Like if I see a lot of cops that are patrolling around and they just look like they have nothing to do, then I'm going to feel good about that.
You feel safe.
If all of a sudden they're missing, like they've been patrolling every day of the week and then all of a sudden they're just gone, that's going to concern me. I'm going to worry about that. And that's part of what my concern is until they can disentangle where LDL particles are clearly part of the immune response or the reparative response from where they could possibly be the initiator or the cause, then I have a lot of trouble with the lipid hypothesis as it stands, this concept that it's absolutely certainly inducing atherosclerosis.
Yeah, and maybe we should give that really old analogy of the ambulance and the scene of the crime.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, if you go around to different traffic accidents, you're going to find there's a higher preponderance of ambulances at traffic accidents. And if you're an alien looking down from outer space, you're like, oh man, these bugs with the red plus sign on them, they're serious trouble. They're going around just smashing into people and causing problems, right?
Wherever there's a problem, they're always there.
Yeah. I mean, we should, from outer space, we should zap them and zap these hives that they seem to return to. They seem to capture these carbon unit people, and they seem to return them to this hive area where they have a pretty decent chance of expiring. Man, we could really help out this planet if we could just zap them all, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, what is the giveaway? The giveaway is if you are an alien and you can listen to, phone calls, you could go, wait a sec. It appears as if somebody has communicated to bring the ambulance there. And I'm telling you, I just outlined that.
It's not the cause. They're there to help, or they're there to do their job.
Yes, that the alternative could be worse to not bringing them there, right? So some number of EMTs and ambulances are going to make mistakes. And so some people will die in an ambulance that otherwise wouldn't have died if their family member took them. So there'll be hospital errors, there'll be ambulance errors, no question. And I think the same thing goes for the process of repair in the body. I'm sure there are things that can go wrong, but there's a big clue, Brian. There's a huge clue, and it brings my 3 favorite words for analysis. It's called all-cause mortality. All-cause mortality should be lower for people who have naturally lower LDL. So if you yourself have a genetic disease that reduces your LDL, something like A-beta lipoproteinemia, it means you have trouble making these APOs that I'm talking about, and therefore you end up with less LDL, considerably less LDL. In theory, if you don't need the LDL, if they're not important to the body, if they're like a waste product, as they're often described, then you should just be living longer than the rest of us. You can take out the whole component of heart disease altogether, right? But that's not I've not been able to find that anywhere. I've not been able to find any decent population of any kind that has a naturally lower LDL that therefore has a lower all-cause mortality.
Yeah.
Those people will have lower cardiovascular disease. A-beta lipoproteinemia, there's familial hypo-beta lipoproteinemia. Sorry, these are 50-cent words, but there are people who naturally have lower levels, and those people who support the lipid hypothesis will point to them and go, see, these people are having less heart disease. This proves the lipid hypothesis. And where I go with that is I'm like, this may in fact show that, yeah, you're having less people being picked up by the ambulances. So there's less ambulance-related deaths, or I should say ambulance-associated deaths.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't stop the deaths. You still have as many people dying, if not more. You still have even more problems, and those people have like A-beta lipoproteinemia to where they have a worse survival rate, right? So anyway, I know we kind of got a little bit lost in the weeds on risk, but I think this is very important for anybody who's really facing this is while I'm very much conceding that I, again, don't know what I don't know, I do find it troubling that the narrative kind of leaves out these important pieces like the balance sheet, if you will, of mortality.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let's start from the very, very top. Total cholesterol, we don't use anymore, really. People realize that doesn't matter as much. HDL cholesterol, it's better if it's higher. Triglycerides are better if it's lower. And the lipid hypothesis says that LDL is better if it's lower, which could be true. But when people go on a low carb or keto diet, a lot of times their HDL improves, it gets higher. Their triglycerides improve, they get lower. But many times the LDL gets a little higher. So the big question here is that what you've been investigating is why would that be a bad thing for those people? So everything else improves. You know, people go on keto. It's like, I feel better. I lose weight. My mental energy is better. My physical energy, like everything's better. But then this one marker, my LDL goes up. So now what? I'm going to die, right?
Right. Well, and this is why I think it's worth looking at it through my eyes. So I just got done talking a lot about risk. Why I sought to look at HDL and triglycerides in particular, and why I put a lot of spotlight on it, especially in the last year, is because this energy model that I'm working out, that I do the presentations on and so forth, it is theoretical. But part of the advantage of working through this is it's giving a lens to look at what may in fact be the more relevant markers. So to kind of summarize what you're saying, the big question to ask is there such a thing as a healthy metabolism that includes a high LDL?
Mm-hmm.
That's the key question.
When
right?
everything else looks good, but that one thing is high, yes. We're not saying, there's context here too. People who are fat burners, there's different things going on in their body, right? And if you have a high LDL and you're eating a standard American diet and your triglycerides are bad, your HDL is bad, then of course it's probably bad that your LDL is high, but not in this context.
But it might be high for the same reason that the ambulances being at the traffic jam are bad. It may be associated towards either a metabolic disease or a chronic inflammatory disease. Mm-hmm. So let me come at this from a different direction. If we were to try to practice medicine and the only metric we had was BMI, we'd have a problem. Like if we couldn't even see the patients, the only thing you were brought was BMI. You already know there's some things for which it's a no-brainer. Okay, somebody has a 45 BMI or 50 BMI, pretty confident they're obese and in a bad way, right? But somebody comes to you with a 28 BMI, that doesn't tell you a lot at all.
Yeah. It could be a bodybuilder.
Exactly. So if all of a sudden then I said, hey, how about if I bring you waist circumference and height? Height plus weight circumference. That would be a massive new level of information because we'd find way higher correlation between that and health overall. You would at least be able to figure out who you wanted to put on a diet and who you didn't.
Absolutely.
Right? Well, LDL, I certainly believed before getting into this research, I thought that was the key indicator. That's the measurement. HDL being good cholesterol, I sort of thought were just kind of separate things. And triglycerides being low also was a separate thing, but not as big of a deal as LDL. LDL is the biggest deal. So at a minimum, in going through and learning about this energy model, I kept going, well, actually, no, it seems more and more like if your triglycerides are low, then these boats needed to be at the level that they were at, if I'm right, in the means to deliver the cargo. So the triglycerides being very low, it should be actually very indicative of why LDL is at whatever level it's at. If I'm powered more by carbs, it's going to be low because I didn't need to traffic that many fatty acids. If LDL is high, then actually maybe I needed to traffic that many VLDLs, the precursor, that would eventually become LDLs. But the big clue was the low triglycerides. And the other big clue is the high HDL, which is the cops patrolling the neighborhood without much to do. So that became the lens. That's where I said, you know what? What if this really is the waist circumference and the height versus the BMI? Well, all I need to do is find every study that stratifies for those three together. And really, there's technically countless numbers that have it in having low HDL and high triglycerides. That's often called, along with small dense LDL, that's often called atherogenic dyslipidemia. And that's well known to be a very bad thing. And that's why two of those markers, low HDL and high triglycerides, are part of metabolic syndrome, the classification for metabolic syndrome. LDL is not. LDL cholesterol doesn't actually carry that much weight relative to triglycerides and HDL. So why is it we've only been hearing about LDL? Well, I didn't realize that until working through the energy model, and the energy model making sense of why those two matter. And now that I'm looking at those two when they matter, that's where the challenge comes in. I'm asking anybody to turn over any studies, anything that would suggest you would have high cardiovascular disease when you had high LDL if your HDL was high and your triglycerides are low. So to get to your point, it could be that you could have high LDL for a bad reason when your HDL is low and or your triglycerides are high. But it could be that it's not the bad reason. It could be that it's high for a bad reason. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. This is probably a lot to take in, especially because they're saying high, low, low, high. Try to recap that without saying, is it possible to do in a really simple terms?
Yeah. So in simple terms, I generally feel good if I see somebody's profile and their HDL is high and their triglycerides are low. Their HDL, the good cholesterol being high, and the triglycerides being low suggests to me that they have
healthy
lipid metabolism.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a healthy metabolism. And I don't want to make it sound as if LDL is insignificant or meaningless to me. I'm not saying that, but I will say that relative to those two metrics, it's not even a close comparison. And that's an evidence-based position. It comes from me looking into the literature, seeing that anytime those three are together, that HDL and triglycerides are far and away way more relevant than LDL.
So you started a group actually called the Lean Mass Hyperresponders on Facebook, and you've been doing experiments on yourself, and a lot of other people have been doing them. And actually, I joined that group when you first made it. I realized I'm on the borderline. I'm basically that. So you found that people who are in good shape, carry some muscle, and go on this ketogenic diet tend to have really high LDL.
Yes, tend to have the highest, actually, of the people typically who go on keto. And it's worth emphasizing that these lean mass hyperresponders, they're special in the sense that it's a phenotype, as in they have three markers generally in common, not just one. It's not just that they have high LDL. They have very high HDL, typically 80 or higher, and they have very low triglycerides, typically 70 or lower. And then their LDL will typically be at like 200 or higher. And it's worth emphasizing that that's usually associated with a genetic disease. Genetic disease known as, many people will have heard the initials FH, which stand for familial hypercholesterolemia. And those are people who have genetically high levels of LDL, whatever diet they're on. And that's what scares a lot of lean mass hyperresponders, understandably, because they see these super high numbers, yet you're in the group. How many times do you see somebody coming in, they go, I don't know what to do. I've never felt better in my life. But
this one
my doctor's freaking out. My wife's freaking out. My pastor's freaking out. It's a daunting problem. Yet, I don't know if you saw this. I ran a poll with them recently where I said, I want a really honest answer. And I led with the negative. I said, do you feel generally significantly worse, slightly worse, about the same, slightly better, or significantly better since becoming a lean mass hyperresponder?
I think I did see that, yeah.
Yeah, it was just, it was practically no contest. that while there were, I want to say maybe 2 or 3 people who felt about the same, quite a number of people felt significantly better. Quite a lot of people feel, some people felt marginally better. Many people felt significantly better.
Yeah.
And you get that day in and day out. And a lot of times people want me to tell them that I'm sure it's okay. And I always push back on that. But I will present the evidence as it stands right now, which is looking pretty good.
Yeah. Well, I always like to take a step back. Obviously, I like to be really evidence-based, but I always like to take a step back and think, okay, does this make sense logically? Does this make sense evolutionarily?
Right.
And this seems just very sound, where just logic, just simple logic says that everything else feels good. All the markers improve except for one. Well, then maybe we just don't know much about this one marker then.
Isn't it fascinating, though, that like sometimes I'm still amazed at how much it will impact me personally. For as much as I'm data-driven, as much as I feel like I'd be the most comfortable being a lean mass hyperresponder, it'll never be, like even if the data continues swinging that way, there'll never be a point where my concern level would be a 0 on a 10 scale.
It's just ingrained in you that it's bad.
It is. And it speaks to the repetition to some degree that I could be aware of that, even if, the AHA changed and if, all of a sudden, there was a mass movement of a shift of opinion. I think I would still have it just because I grew up believing cholesterol equals death.
Yeah.
You're more cholesterol, the more you're going to die.
Well, that's a problem with a lot of things. It's meat is bad. There's so many things and Gary Fettke calls it generational knowledge. Where if you're just taught that, if you go to med school and you're taught one thing and then your professors were taught that thing by their professors, it's ingrained in you.
Right. It's powerful. I mean, it's really hard to overstate how much he's right about that, about there being kind of a generational, there really is something that can really only be learned with this hard data. And this is where I feel like we were lucky to be born into an age in which this information can be peer-to-peer shared, because we couldn't easily be figuring this stuff out otherwise.
Yeah,
never mind whether we're right or not. We have the ability to at least find out better than we could have before.
Well, before, Dave Feldman would have just been programming video games and no one would have cared.
Right.
But now you get to be on Twitter, you're doing conferences around the country, the world, and you're spreading this information. Yeah.
Well, but likewise, I owe a great debt to everybody like yourself, like the other lean mass hyperresponders who I can just draw information on the fly. There's, we have a new level of research capability that just couldn't have existed before. And I've certainly felt the ire of it from the other side, from the more traditionalist side. They're not happy about, from their perspective. And I think the intentions are positive. I think that they mean well. But, this isn't IRB approved and this should be going through a committee and this should be and so forth. And this isn't to say that those things can help to mitigate risk. But there is a darker side to that too, which is that it also can create a degree of bureaucracy that can really slow down the gain of knowledge, the things that can be found out and discovered within reason. And it's tough because it's hard for me to believe that a lot of the experiments that just had major headway going back, 50 years, 70 years, et cetera, before there was as much bureaucracy, could just be done on the fly. Mm-hmm. That there's lots of pushback for that now.
Yeah. And all those views are entrenched, and so it's even harder to change them. There's so much going on here, and kind of leads into the Peter Attia podcast that you mentioned earlier that was kind of weird listening to. I thought he was sort of really on board. He's done keto for years. He seems like a really smart guy, and I know you respect him a lot as well. But he just had a huge problem with your energy model.
Sure.
Yeah, and maybe you could talk about that a little bit, because it just seems like he is so obsessed with the general population data. And he's like, well, I have to tell a patient, and this is the data I see, and they're in front of me, and what am I going to tell them? I don't have hard data otherwise. Well, my main thing is we're looking at this general data for the population under the context of a mixed diet or a bad standard American diet, and that's way different for the context of a fat-adapted keto diet.
Yeah, I feel as if I really do understand it more. Like it's, how if you're trying to bring somebody up to speed on something that, and keto is just a great example. you're trying to tell somebody about keto. You're trying to say, yeah, I try to have red meat in almost every meal I eat. Right?
Yeah, me too.
Just telling somebody who might be truly a well-educated, nutrition-focused person, this is anathema. This is crazy talk, right? And really, if we were to have been talking about this like 15 years ago to some, random people who were very nutritionally aware, it would have been a longer haul. Right now, it's easier because there really is a lot more data that backs it up, and there's a lot more observance of the markers that can suggest it. Even so, yes, there's still pushback on red meat. It's causing cancer, et cetera, et cetera. But a Peter Attia or a Tom Dayspring are probably more accepting of red meat not being as deleterious as it was once feared to be, right?
Yeah.
But it's a process. It's, in the case of cholesterol, it's going to take more and more data. As more data shows up, and particularly this is why I'm so interested in lean mass hyperresponder phenotype and the group altogether. I really want to observe them closely, and I really want more and more data to come out of this group to establish if in fact we're right and that the concern level is not as high as you would think it would be, because that's very compelling data. It's not just that we have people who have low cardiovascular risk markers. We have people who have very low cardiovascular risk markers while having super high levels of LDL. So that data gets harder and harder to brush past. And that's not going to just be for Peter Attia. That's going to be for lipidologists throughout the field. It's harder to ignore the data that's very sound and concrete. The downside is that even so, the lipid hypothesis is very difficult to falsify. And the reason is because they will always fall back on, hey, we just can't see the atherosclerotic burden because it takes,
so long.
years to decades. Exactly. And I obviously have a little bit of a problem with that because I don't like anything that's not falsifiable, or for that matter, we should assume is the null hypothesis until at least a few decades have passed to show otherwise, particularly if in that course of that time, there's going to be so much pushback for people who want to just choose for themselves what they want to do. But that is the reality of what we live in now. So for what it's worth, I think that with Peter, it is just a matter of an accumulation of data if that's where we're going to go. I do think that this is something he feels very strongly about and has for some time. And he's very close to Thomas Dayspring. Thomas Dayspring is absolutely very opinionated on the lipid hypothesis. And I think that that's just going to be a process, moving it forward.
Yeah. So what's your sort of takeaway from that podcast? Did anything go either way or any other?
A lot of people came away with a different opinion than I did. I think without question, that was a net positive for me in the research. There was a lot more. First of all, it advanced the discussion. I always want to advance the discussion. I wanted somebody of Peter's caliber to fire his best shots at it, to bring up his best, most cogent points so that they can be talked about. But the other part of it is that it also brought new people who, some of which I can't even call out or anything, but who didn't know about my research before, who now do know about it, and who may help to open some more doors to helping find out more about it. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for having been on the podcast. There's no question. But again, per what I said before, I do think it's going to be a process. I didn't think coming on the podcast I was going to be convincing Peter. Honestly.
Yeah.
And it's no knock on Peter at all. Peter, again, I think Peter's very brilliant. I love his podcast. I love everything. I think very highly of Peter. But, for the same reason that for a lot of entrenched low carbers, you could come with very strong data that their diet isn't going to work. If it turned out that somebody really had very compelling data, it may be a process, assuming that existed. Right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing is if we keep seeing lean mass hyperresponders showing thin CIMT numbers, CIMT is carotid intima media thickness. That's the ultrasound you can get on each side of your neck. I don't know if you've been following me.
Yeah. I have that.
Re-regressed it again.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to talk about that. Your experiments and how you do all this CIMT testing to see like a live result of how it's going.
Yeah, man, that was... So to kind of set up a little bit for your listeners, this may be some of the most powerful data I have to date, which is I went keto. About a year into keto, I started arranging CIMT testing, and I wanted to be sure that I got it every 6 months. It's very simple. You go into a doctor's office, usually it's a tech who performs it, and preferably you want to have the same tech and the same machine so that calibration differences aren't that much. And then they do what in effect is an ultrasound on the left and right side of your neck. Those are the left and right carotid arteries, the very big arteries that, supply a lot of blood and oxygen to your brain. And there's a thickness, carotid intima media thickness, as in the intima and the media together. That's the thickness that they're looking to measure. And it's in micrometers, I believe. Anyway, when they detect it, they get a score for each side. And from the moment I started, it turned out, to my surprise, my risk level was something in the neighborhood of around 75 to 80% for my age group. So if you were to grab a whole bunch of us and put us on a bell curve, I was at the higher end of risk when I started out. And over 3 more tests that were spaced about 6 months apart, the thickness on my left and right side regressed, as in it got thinner. Even though it's not supposed to, it's supposed to stay about the same thickness or even progress with my age.
Exactly. I remember I did a podcast with Dr. Brett Scher, and he said, it doesn't really go down really ever or regress. Yeah. It's always sort of progressively getting worse. So that's cool.
And this is where it gets interesting. So I did 4 of those. And then before my 5th one, I did an experiment where I literally and intentionally gained weight. I gained about 19 pounds. Without going too much into all the details of it, it was to see what would happen with my lipid numbers. And all in all, there was a great amount of fantastic data that came out of it. But my favorite thing, is I also got to see what happened to my CIMT. And I speculated that there was a chance it might head the other direction. That even though it was regressing up to that point, maybe it would get thicker and more inflamed. And that's exactly what happened. It shot up to the highest it had been on both sides since starting this.
This is why I believe you're eating a lot of bread for this one.
Well, bread along with fat. So I had a lot of pizzas.
That's a killer combo.
Sandwiches. Yep, it is the killer combo. Seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're going to have carbs, then drop down fat. If you're having both fat and carbs in high quantities, that's the go-to way to gain weight.
It's also a go-to for deliciousness, unfortunately.
That's true. Like the donut is a perfect example of the killer food. So then last month happened, which was I got another CIMT and it had regressed again, both on the left and right side, as I predicted. So
during which test? This is a carnivore?
No, this was just before I had done carnivore.
Okay. And then how did you get it back down? On what type of diet?
On a keto diet. More specifically, while cranking up at those high levels of 200 LDL-C and 2,000 LDL-P or more. Basically, short answer is this. While I had my LDL cholesterol super crazy high, but on keto, my carotid intima media thickness was regressing, which is just what the literature will tell you. The literature will tell you that high LDL particle count will increase your carotid artery thickness. It's doing exactly the opposite in my data. Exactly the opposite.
Yeah, I love it. And didn't you also find the opposite of that too, where you lowered your LDL on an unhealthy diet?
Yep. On the standard American diet where I was gaining the weight, my LDL-C had returned to what it was before I started the keto diet. Now remember, when I started the keto diet a year in, I found that my carotid intima media thickness on both sides, actually, I think on one side it was an 85% risk, and on the other side, I think it was like 65 or something. My right was the thicker of the two. So bear this in mind. I probably, while I was on the standard American diet before I started keto, was already at super high risk. I go keto. I may have actually already been regressing it for 2 years and didn't know that.
Yeah, I bet.
And then further kept regressing it. Then I go standard American, and guess what? My LDL-C drops to what it was when I started, which was at around 130, I think 138 maybe. And my LDL particle count was down at around 1,000, so just short of optimal on both sides. Both LDL-C and LDL-P, I was just about in happy land with my doctor. And yet my carotid intima media thickness thickened on both sides to the highest risk level that I've had on record.
It's so crazy.
It is. Obviously, I was banking on both of them regressing. That's the only reason I could be jovial about it. So I was like, well, I think I'm going to go back to keto. I think my LDL is going to skyrocket, and I think it's going to work out.
Yeah. Well, I love it that you're doing this. I mean, no one's really doing it as hardcore as you, but I know other people are kind of jumping on and doing some of this stuff with you, and also just regular people getting their numbers from their doctor and feeling great are seeing this as well. So it's not like it's only you, right?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, I owe a tremendous debt to a lot of people who both follow the work and then contribute to it. Certainly, I've got to call out my colleague, Siobhan Huggins. She's done some amazing things, including really some great breakthroughs with Lp(a). And then there's a lot of other people like Keto Paul, I forget his full name, Paul McLean, I want to say, has actually taken a lot of considerable expense of his own to build a lab in his house, to do even faster frequency tests than I'm doing, like to where he could do it like every half hour to an hour. And there's a lot of stories like this that are emerging that really just delight me to death. I would love for there to be 100 other people, 1,000 other people who are, again, making informed risk choices. That's the thing. I can never emphasize this enough. Obviously, because there isn't, the committees and the bureaucracy and stuff, there is risks that, you've got to be assuming for yourself. But that said, with this in mind, I think that there's enormous amount of knowledge that can be gained. And certainly I've been in awe at what I've been able to just find with low-hanging fruit. Sure, I do have a bit, I guess you could say, a talent. Maybe it's the engineer thing of just being really hardcore meticulous and, obsessive compulsive about controlling all of the variables. But I don't think you have to be a clone of me to really get some amazing data. And anybody who's listening to this, man, I encourage you to consider what it is that you can do to help contribute to the whole of the knowledge we have.
Yeah, that's awesome. Join the Facebook group, or if you're not a lean mass hyperresponder, they could go to your cholesterolcode.com.
Yes, for sure. And yeah, lean mass hyperresponders in particular, I mean, the reason they're so important is because they kind of, I believe, anchor one end of the spectrum. Perhaps the end of the spectrum that we have a particular reason to look at in the context of perhaps a very healthy lipid system. Mm-hmm. I think this is speculation, but I think actually lean mass hyperresponders probably enjoy a higher level of autophagy. I think that they're in a blended fasted state. That's why it's also hard for them to multi-day fast.
Yeah, I've never done more than a 22-hour fast.
Right.
It's just not for me. I just have no interest in it, and I'm too hungry.
Yeah.
And we'll tell people what autophagy is.
Well, autophagy is a layperson's way of putting it is it's letting the cell rest. It's they can do a lot of housekeeping. Yeah, internally. Like if you think about it, when you eat something and you release insulin is like a lunch bell. Right. So you come and get it. We've got food and
energy. Yeah.
And cells have to react to a lot of hormones because hormones are kind of like a large, and I'm going to use another geeky networking term, but for the engineers out there, especially in software, hormones are like events, and organs can be like event dispatchers. They dispatch an event. Hey, there's an event going on. Everybody pay attention. Hey, pay attention, everybody. But your cells need time of their own to take care of their own stuff. They have things like misfolded proteins they've got to deal with, and waste they've got to work with, and sometimes just restructuring. There's a lot of things that they're supposed to be doing. And that's why I think a lot of these experiments that did calorie restriction back in the day would be so advantageous if you're already in a state of abundance all the time, because you can shortchange your own cells from getting the autophagy that they would like to do, particularly if you're inducing a lot of insulin response. But that's what I like about the keto diet in particular, is it speaks to me as a network engineer because it's distributed. That's to say there's a lot more that cells do on their own in a fat-centric diet than in a carb-centric diet. A carb-centric diet necessarily has to be more top-down. It has to have a bolus of glucose coming in and then a response to the stage 1 insulin response from the pancreas. Sorry, I know I'm probably getting geeky again here, but the idea being that autophagy is letting your cells do their own thing as much as possible.
Don't always be eating. Let's rest a little bit.
Yeah.
Things happen when you're not eating.
Exactly.
If you're not doing work, let those guys rest. Give them a break. Give them a little vacay.
Yeah. And for that matter, don't let your body be in a state where it thinks it always is eating. That's the key. So you hear the term hyperinsulinemia, as in high insulin in the blood. Persistently high insulin in the blood is such a big, serious, dark sign, and is, of course, associated with type 2 diabetes and obesity and everything. But the bottom
all
line,
chronic disease, basically. It's like the root of most chronic diseases.
So you look at lean mass hyperresponders, they have super low insulin. They have such a low insulin under the curve, area under the curve for their insulin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think that they probably have really optimized autophagy. I think that when I'm on my full-blown keto diet, my CGM, my continuous glucose monitor, it shows just this flat line. Mm. You can't even figure out when I ate.
That's awesome.
Like if I gave you the line right now, you couldn't know when it happened. And that's because I believe my total necessary insulin for use is next to non-existent. I actually want to do a craft test on this at some point, where I actually just have a low-carb, high-fat meal, because nobody ever does this. But I want to see if there actually even is that much of an insulin response in the wake of, 1,000-calorie meal. I'd be very curious.
Yeah. I know with the craft test, it takes hours, and you have to, well, actually the short one, did they shorten it where you can only like 3 hours and you can kind of get the same picture?
Yeah, where I'd want to test is at the 2-hour mark.
2 hours, yeah, maybe it's even 2 hours. Okay, so I just talked to Stephan Guyenet the other day, and I don't like to argue with people on my podcast, but I was, going through all this stuff. He's all like balanced everything. Like my idea is just to eat food that doesn't taste good, and then you won't eat too much. I don't know, just kind of like weird ideas. But super smart guy, he's a respected researcher. And did you read The Hungry Brain?
No, I've heard of it though.
Okay, well, anyway, all these people sort of in the middle, I'll call them. They don't support keto, but I don't know, they don't support vegan or high carb. They're just kind of like in the middle. They try to just say, it doesn't matter, burn carbs, burn fat, like whatever works for you, all that kind of thing. There just seems like there's so much data and all kinds of things that point that it's better to run on fat, and you're not going to have to eat all the time, or you tend to eat less. There's so many things. What are your views of why it's good to run on fat?
So I try to be diet agnostic, obviously,
which is good.
I practice a ketogenic diet. I like how I feel on a ketogenic diet. I like the outcomes for me personally. I think a good way to touch on this subject is I have 2 friends in Colorado, lifelong buddies. They are both vegan. Mm-hmm. They are both healthy. I've seen their blood work. It looks great. Both of them will concede this. They will gain weight if they don't exercise. One of them does marathons. The other one does HIIT. And whenever the holidays come around, they both, again, they're almost like twins in this way. They gain weight and then they have to work it off, or like, in fact, one of them's working off a lot of weight right now. I should say that, but, and they both, even though the blood work's really great and so forth, both of them eat all day long.
Yeah.
Like that's a necessity. And I think that's one of them was able to maintain really good levels until he hit around 36, 37, something along those lines.
Years of age?
Yeah. So they're about my age now. Like I'm 45 and they're in their mid 40s. And one of them was like, he could just eat anything he wanted and had like a bunch of vegan junk food and would just eat it whenever he wanted to. And around, mid 30s, that changed and he had to change it up, but he was very adamant about remaining vegan and really kind of went on a multi-year challenge of sorts, trying to sort things out. And finally did figure out that he could do whole food plant-based, but he didn't need to eat all day long. And really, like it's almost like from the moment he gets up, he's snacking. And I think that can work, and you'll end up with lower insulin under the curve than if you were eating these in large quantities and inducing as much of a response. But I concede that, at least for me personally, that would be very hard. First of all, I never really was a big plant person, just as far as taste goes, my palate. Yeah. Like I've just always loved meat. And then the other end of it is that I don't like spending a lot of time eating.
Exactly.
I've never liked that, actually.
Oh, I never liked snacking. Well, yeah. Well, my thing, I just eat 2 giant meals and I'm happy. I never think about food otherwise.
Yeah, it's time consuming. It's both time consuming to be eating, and I don't want to be thinking
exactly.
about it.
That's what Stephan Guyenet actually conceded, that he did do low carb for a while and he wasn't hungry. It was great. And I'm like, well, why'd you go back? But he grows his own food and he grows potatoes. Anyway, but it can't be good long run. Well, maybe it can. I don't want to say that.
I
Do you
don't
think
know.
it? Yeah. Do you think it's bad if you're constantly digesting food all day, every day for your whole life? Like, will it catch up to you?
I don't know. I'll say the other friend who seems to have just always been like well built for vegan and loves it. For him, it seems like a very comfortable way of life. It seems like he performs pretty well. So he's the guy who does the marathons, and he'll eat through the marathons. That's actually sort of the one time where he kind of cheats the most, is he'll have like some goos that are vegan goos of some kind. But he otherwise, is pretty adamant about it's plant-based. Right. But I'll concede it is something I've thought about a lot. So I was like, there may be a low threshold with which you engage your GI tract to where it's not that big of a deal. But I feel like I'd like to turn that off for spans of time, particularly given those two. If I were to pick on a reason I think it'd be bad, it's that your enterocytes are no different than all the other cells. They could probably use some autophagy time, right? Yeah. Why keep that bile swimming through and, all the other stuff? Why not just chill it out for a while?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are examples, like you're saying, of people who can pull it off, but I guess there's genetic components, and there's not everyone who's so good at doing it correctly and good at, say, not overeating or not eating junk food. And also, I hear a lot of these sort of mixed diet marathon people who got tons of problems, and they're eating all the goos and they're doing the high carb, and like Tim knows, diabetes, or they're swollen or they're inflamed or their recovery time sucks. Like so many problems with being a carb burner, and then they switched over to being a fat burner and everything's solved. Yeah, I don't want to pick on any particular individual, but there's of course a very prominent individual who's been talking a lot about, forget keto, just have a sensible diet, have a balanced diet. Layne Norton?
No, you'll know who I'm talking about. But the point is, my concern is that there's a degree for which you can, I don't know if I want to say get away with, but you can not have to put up with the consequences of your diet while young for many people. Yeah. And it's different for different people. But for me, it was certainly into my mid-30s, for what it's worth. I was a stick. I was a rail. And I was eating ramen and Totino's all the time while chugging Coke. Yeah. Up until my 30s, I started to become a little more conscious. And so, hey, now I'm going to eat healthy. I'm going to have Subway 2 or 3 times a week, right? Yeah. And if you were to have asked me then, I would have said a lot of what I hear, which is, just have a balanced diet, It's okay to have a little junk food, just not a lot. Yeah. And my idea of a little junk food then was 3 times a week, 4 times a week, right? But the problem is, as we have observed over and over again, and it's different for different people. Some people do seem to just last forever, but that's not most people. Most people, in stages, the food will catch up to them. The bad choices, and not even just necessarily food. It could be alcohol, it could be smoking, it could be excessive sunlight, whatever it is. They seem to be immune to it until a point, and then there was a fall off. Yeah. And so it's hard for me to take nutrition advice from people who don't seem to have as much, I guess, I don't want to sound ageist, but particularly if they're really young. Yeah, no, that makes sense. If you're really young and you're going, no, just do whatever. Yeah, it's like, I eat McDonald's all the time, whatever. Yeah, McDonald's it's fine. It's fine. Look at me. Yeah. I'm just chowing it down, and I just ran another, marathon. No problem. I want to be like, okay, I just want a crystal ball so I could look at you in about, 20 years, 30 years, and I want to see if you're working your way back from that, because that's what happened to me. Exactly. No, well, it started to happen to me, and I got into it pretty early. I mean, when I go to these conferences, I feel like I'm the youngest person there by 5 years, where, everyone else has dealt with these problems and it's caught up with them. And that's also what I'm dealing with, is because my peers are still in their early 30s, maybe mid-30s. They kind of think what you're talking about. They're like, yeah, whatever. I eat everything. Who cares? What are you talking about? Yeah, I'll bet you get made fun of a lot. Yeah, it's ridiculous. I'll bet they're like, well, that weird thing you're into, Yeah. Oh, it's a huge joke. I mean, I can't even get into it, but yes. No, but it is frustrating, because without actually having that perspective, without actually having to know any kind of struggle to maintain against what it is that you thought you would always be at your whole life, you can't get that degree of focus. that you'd want to do it. Because I certainly put up with that as I was kind of getting into this with some other 40-year-old friends who themselves had not fallen off until they'd gotten to their mid 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, this just as recently as 2 months ago, I had a friend who had been making fun of me for doing keto. He's very fit and 1 year older than me. And just 2 months ago, I had a long conversation with him where he secretly became keto, and he just absolutely dreaded the point at which I would find out. And I was like, bygones, I don't care at all, but I'm glad that you've taken steps to, deal with these issues you've been having. But that's the problem. It's time scale. Until somebody's struggling with it, it's hard to know.
Absolutely. And also, even if you are in reasonable shape, people don't know what the next level, what they could be feeling is. And luckily, a lot of my friends, actually, half of them do really embrace this and do it. And I've seen great changes, and they look amazing. They feel amazing. It's partly the reason why I got into it. And I didn't know how bad I felt until I look back.
Isn't that amazing?
Even though, it's crazy. But I was never, sorry, I just want to say, I was always in shape my whole life, in reasonable shape. I mean, I go up and down a little bit, but I was always, you know what I mean? No one's like, oh, that guy needs to go on a diet. Like, I was playing sports and everything. And that's why I think it's interesting that I went that much better beyond.
Yeah, I really thought things like GI stress were just something unique to me, but also were just likely to get worse as I got older. It was just always a part of my life. And I go keto and it's almost entirely gone. And I'm just dumbfounded that I had just gotten used to it that much, that it was sort of like background white noise. That it was just something that was there. Another one is sickness. Man, I'm telling you, it's been over 3 years now, and I'm still just astonished at how little I get sick from anything like infectious or bacterial. It's crazy to me to think that it would have such an impact.
That's what I wanted to bring that up with you. I haven't been sick in 4 years. When I started this, I used to get sick, like normal people, every couple months, all that. Haven't got sick in 4 years. But guess what? I just got sick for the first time. I have to admit it. And it's almost like I was doing one of a Dave Feldman experiment to see how much I could get away with, to see if I could get sick. And I put every single stressor on my body I could over this past weekend. There's all these events. I was out super late. I was drinking. I ate bad food. I went out in the cold. I've been doing this cold therapy, like walking my dog in shorts and slippers and a t-shirt. I haven't worn a jacket this whole winter once.
Wow.
And so I did all of those: cold, no sleep, alcohol, bad food. And then I worked out. After 3 days of that, I worked out really hard. In an hour after the workout, it just set in. But then I still feel like I barely got sick. I was like, my nose is stuffed up. I mean, maybe you can hear it a little now. But I mean, it was barely anything. It lasted for like 2.5 days. But I just learned about the immune system. I mean, I know that I've gotten pathogens or bacteria or whatever it was over the last 4 years. And my immune system was like, nope, who cares? And then this one time, a lot of sickness is going around. I went to, football party, tons of people there. And I know a lot of people were sick. They talked about it. And my immune system just couldn't handle it. It was just too low from all the stressors.
So this is why, I'm very interested in where LDL plays a part in the immune response. And I've got to give a call out to Siobhan, who, by the way, is going to be putting together a fantastic article on this here pretty soon. But as I mentioned earlier, with their binding to pathogens, with having vitamin E on board, but I do genuinely believe that they are part of the immune defense. And I do think that there's quite a lot of evidence behind that, which you can actually find on our site as well. But more than anything else, as you know, I like my own data to tell me in a personal way, that what's that saying? The N of one may only be an N of one, but it's the most important one.
Yeah.
I have gotten sick my whole life. I've gotten a cold at least once a year. Sometimes I've gotten the flu. And while I've been in Las Vegas for 7 years before I went keto, I had bronchitis 3 times. And in the last 3+ years, I've not gotten any of those, not one time. It's the longest stretch of my not being sick in my life that I can remember.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I may eat these words later. I might get sick several times this year. I don't know. But right now, it completely blows me away.
Is it about nutrient density? I'm really into nutrient density, and I think that has something to do with it too, where, bioavailable nutrients. And
it could be. But I do in particular, I know I'm going to sound like somebody who is into the thing that they're into.
Mhm.
And no question, that's true. But I do
Aren't
think
we
that
all?
there is a large component in just total lipoprotein availability in the serum
Mm.
for the process. That's why they believe those people had that genetic disease I was talking about before, familial hypercholesterolemia, why they think it may have actually been a net benefit during times where infection was a greater risk,
Mm.
because these same people would say survive pandemics.
Mm.
Right. Now, that said, the assumption is, oh, well, now we have modern medicine, which can deal with a lot of this. But can it, to the degree that we don't have to worry about it anymore? I don't know.
I want to learn more about the immune system. Well, anyway, okay. So you mentioned N of 1 studies. So you're really into N of 1 studies, and I think a lot of people hate on them. But in nutrition, like you said, you are the most important. And in the end, the individual is the most important. So what do you think about N of 1 studies in general in the nutrition world?
Obviously, I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I think that it's absolutely fair to say, hey, this is an N of 1. This is just one person doing one experiment, etc. That said, there's absolutely no way I would have gotten as far as I did if I were going through the process of trying to write grants and getting the right people on board to conduct the exact right studies. I've been able to do a series of steps in succession by just bankrolling my own blood work and then being obsessive, compulsive, methodical on execution of these experiments. And so things like the Feldman protocol, they really just came up because I repeated it with myself several times before I made it very clear to other people. And there are a number of other things, like, for example, the coffee triglyceride connection. We found that more people would have high levels of triglycerides if they drink coffee, if they happen to be part of this small subset who seem to have this sensitivity to it. But, we could quickly strike up saying, hey, why don't we just have a series of N of 1 experiments? The thing is, it'll be plural. If we put it out there, some people will take it on for themselves, they'll do it, and then they can bring it back. I feel that this is the age for coming into N of 1 experiments because of how quickly we can share this data across the world. So, yeah, I'm not only am I a fan of it, but again, I hope that we'll see more. I hope we'll see more people that can properly and effectively execute these experiments and bring the data back to the community.
Absolutely. And even if you don't do it for the sake of the community or do it really regimented or share it with anyone, just do it on yourself. And if you feel good, then keep going. This is a great saying. The best indicator of future health is how you feel now or your present health. And don't listen to me for medical advice, but go with your intuition. If you feel good.
The most important measurement. I think a lot of people don't realize that. Certainly there can be other things that can measure a problem even while you feel good, granted, right? But if you feel good, not in the wake of, say, taking a drug where you then crash later, but if you're feeling good 24/7.
You're doing coke.
Yeah, don't do coke and count that as feeling good. I'm talking persistently feeling good. If you feel good, round the clock, then be hard pressed to believe that it's as simple as, you should be taking this one type of prescribed diet or this one structured approach or something along those lines. Investigate for yourself and come to your own conclusions as to what it is that you want to be able to have for things like nutrient balance and so forth. Research all sides, but be aware that even for as much as I measure stuff, I don't consider anything as relevant as how I feel. Nothing's as relevant as that.
I agree. Let's go out on that. Where can we find you? You're pretty active on Twitter.
I am. I'm pretty active as Dave Keto on Twitter. And of course, you can find myself or Siobhan. We're at cholesterolcode.com. And yes, if you turn out to be a lean mass hyperresponder, I'll just tell you the cut points. It's LDL of 200 or higher, HDL of 80 or higher, or triglycerides of 70 or lower, or just roundabouts in that area. You may want to consider joining our Facebook group, Lean Mass Hyperresponders. Just do a search on Lean Mass Hyperresponders. You'll find it.
Yeah, it's a good spot, and you can talk to some people. And are you doing any other experiments coming up or any other cool things?
Yes. Well, there may be a pretty controversial experiment I may be doing next month, but I can't say any more than that.
Okay.
Just keep an eye out. That might be something.
All right. I'm there. Anything else though in the future? Any other just general stuff?
Well, I hope to have
one of the conferences. What are you doing?
Yeah, I'll be at Low Carb Denver I'll be at the Carnivory Con, I think it's called, or Carnivore Con. It's the one that's also going to be in Boulder. I'll be at Keto Fest. I'll be at Low Carb USA, and I'll be at Low Carb Houston. Those are the ones I'm pretty sure I'm booked for right now that are in the solids.
Awesome.
But I don't know past that point because there are some other academic partnering that I'm doing right now that may result in some exciting things. We'll see.
All right, we'll keep it big then. It sounds good though.
Will do. All right.
All right, thanks, Dave.
Thank you for having me on, Brian.
Okay, it's me again. Please help us out with the Food Lies film in these last few days of the campaign by pre-ordering a copy and looking at the other perks like the Eat Meat shirt, the movie poster, and the Real Foods coin. Click through the link in the show notes or at foodlies.org. Come say hi on social media where I post and comment daily. Search for Food Lies on any platform. And also, please leave a review of the podcast. I really appreciate these reviews and they help get the podcast more visibility. Thanks again and catch you next week.